With that, things over to Mr. Diamond.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and it's great to spend some time with all of you today. I just want to start by thanking the Health Law and Policy Institute and the Initiative on Global Law and Policy for the Americas for the time and the opportunity here to talk about an issue that I spend, or a set of issues rather, that I spend way too much time looking at and always enjoy getting a chance to share some knowledge on. So, of course, for the time today, we'll focus on global vaccine policy during the ongoing pandemic. It will be a bit of a menu of hot topics with a couple themes to help pull things together. Just to build on a bit of what Jessica had mentioned about my background as well, which directly relevant for the time here today. I've spent a long time working in the vaccine law and policy space. To date, I've counseled about 10 global vaccine manufacturers on routine immunization issues. And then since the beginning of the pandemic, I have worked specifically with 5 of those manufacturers on launching and maintaining their COVID-19 vaccination program. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but kind of a fun way, if I can find a silver lining in it, to get to dive into some topical issues that can have a real impact. And just one quick disclaimer before I get started. Everything I'll mention today is readily available within the public domain, so nothing that would present any problems from a confidentiality standpoint. In terms of a quick agenda for how we can spend our time over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to start off by setting the stage with a couple contextual notes about the vaccine ecosystem, as well as situate a couple themes that have been particularly relevant over the past 2 years throughout the pandemic, and I would argue will continue to be relevant for many years to come. From there, I want to transition into a menu of key topics in no particular order, and these are just some of the ones that have been particularly hot button issues, if you will, during the pandemic. Hopefully connect a few dots for things that you've seen in the news cycle along the way as well. And then finally, I think we'll have some time for questions here at the end, and would love to hear from you all on questions either specifically related to the presentation or anything just in general about the vaccine policy space. Happy to take some time there as well. So to start off with a bit of context, what you see here on the slide are a few charts with COVID-19 vaccination rates across the globe, the US specifically, and then Texas specifically. So I'll dive into the rates in a moment, but what I want to do is actually zoom out and take a look at the trajectory and some of the issues for contextual purposes that get us to this current snapshot of immunization rates. So it turns out vaccine development is rather complicated and rather expensive to do. And this is something that we maybe have had a bit of a skewed view around over the past 2 years because innovation has progressed at such a rapid pace. But generally speaking, the success rate for a vaccine candidate entering phase 1, making it all the way through phase 3 clinical trials, is only about 13%, which means the vast majority of candidates fail during the clinical trials process. And those numbers are roughly consistent with other biological products, if anything, a little bit lower. And particularly for the pandemic context, it's important to remember that that type of R&D is predicated on, during a pandemic, the ability to share virus samples in a timely way across borders. And this is something that the WHO, of course, plays a strong role in via the international health regulations. But that research and development really is a global effort in the sense that it takes a great deal of coordination from a variety of different stakeholder types. So even if we take a situation where it's one of the 13% that makes it all the way through phase 3, we still have the challenge of the fact that there is very little harmonization for regulatory requirements across different jurisdictions. This is something that's really come to the fore during the pandemic, but it was certainly a challenge before the pandemic. So particularly if we think about this notion of emergency authorization for a vaccine, this is something that's been in the news cycle obviously a lot lately. We have in the US a process within the FDA called Emergency Use Authorization, and EUA, which before the pandemic had only been used once for another vaccine, but now has become a bit more of a regular thing for a few of the candidates over the past 2 years. But the fact is, emergency approval processes do not necessarily exist in other jurisdictions. So if you are a vaccine manufacturer trying to launch a product, whether in a pandemic or otherwise, you will have to navigate a variety of very different regulatory approval processes. There's a slight bit of standardization if domestic regulators are relying on what are called stringent regulatory authorities. So an FDA or a EMA in the EU, but generally speaking, each jurisdiction is doing its own thing, so to speak. So even if you could get past the regulatory approval hurdles in all the jurisdictions where you're launching a product, you still have a related challenge of that only gets you an approval. It doesn't get you an actual manufactured dose. It doesn't get you to fill and finish, which actually creates the shot itself. And it doesn't get you to distribution. So all of those issues are contextual points that have their own challenges that we'll dive into in our time today. Even if you happen to sort out all of those challenges, you still have fundamental access barriers. And these access barriers, both within the US and elsewhere in the world, are permeated by deep inequities across different population groups. And we see these inequities persist obviously on a global level, but also within individual countries as well. We'll get into some of those access barriers in our time today. So all of that really leads to what you see here on the screen, which are candidly rather low immunization rates, all things considered. So the current COVID-19 immunization rate globally sits at about, for fully vaccinated individuals, so 2 doses if it's a Pfizer or Moderna shot, sits at about 39%. In the US, we fare a bit better at 58%, and in Texas, we sit at the moment at about 53%. So at best, we've got about half the population eligible for receiving a COVID-19 vaccine fully vaccinated. What you also don't see here on the screen is we have I'm sure as you're familiar with, a whole spectrum of routine immunizations, everything from a flu shot to a shingles dose. All of those rates have historically, before the pandemic, been far below global targets set by the US and a variety of other regulators like the CDC. Those rates have in fact gone down during the pandemic, for adults gone down quite significantly. This is because, as you can imagine, the disturbances in just regular visits to your PCP to make sure you're up to date on your shots. These are things that obviously fell by the wayside over the past 2 years. So a bit of what people are looking at now is on the routine side of things, what are some of the policy interventions we can put in place to push back on low rates, either specifically for COVID vaccines or for the entire routine immunization portfolio? If we take account of this context and narrow the funnel, if you will, a little bit to the vaccine ecosystem at the moment, there are really 3 themes that I think that I've seen quite acutely in the past 2 years, and I think will also be a big part of where we're going in the coming years. The first theme has to do with vaccine innovation, and I alluded to this a moment ago, but it's probably fair to say that in the past 2 years, we've gone through roughly 20 years worth of innovation in the vaccine space. That is a good thing from a public health standpoint, of course, but presents its own challenges as everything else around it, that broader ecosystem, tries to catch up. So we have a variety of new products in the vaccine ecosystem, not just for COVID, but also throughout the routine immunization portfolio. We, of course, have new platforms as well, like the mRNA platform, something you all see a lot in the news cycle, no doubt, which will have ramifications for the development of new products for a long time to come. We also even have exploration of novel delivery mechanisms. So everything from self-administered vaccines to microneedle patches and other innovations that are really intended to help make those access barriers a little less significant. The second theme that really has come to the fore during the pandemic, and this is a familiar theme in the vaccine space, is vaccine hesitancy. Obviously something that I think we're all familiar with to some degree, even if we don't work in the vaccine space. But what we've really learned throughout the pandemic is something that folks in public health have known for a long time, which is that hesitancy is very complicated. It isn't just quote unquote anti-vaxxers in the news cycle or on Facebook or some other social media platform. Vaccine hesitancy, in fact, encompasses issues like convenience. So how close is someone to an immunization site? Maybe the only immunization site they're close to is a pharmacy. How or if is there a degree of complacency involved? So do people understand the public health importance, the individual importance of vaccination, such that they're willing to commit the time and the effort, perhaps take time off from work, perhaps travel several miles to an immunization site to get their doses. And then also it, of course, encompasses confidence. And confidence is an issue that obviously tends to show up more in the news cycle, but in particular, it has raised questions throughout the pandemic that are unique and I think will require a closer look in the years to come. So questions, just a smattering of ones that I've heard, and maybe you hear some of these around the Thanksgiving table in a couple weeks, but this notion of, has the vaccine development process been rushed? Is the notion of an emergency authorization something that's inherently not as safe as the other vaccines that we have available? Is the government, because of the amount of government dollars involved in this process, is the government, so to speak, in bed with manufacturers on this process and generally with regard to any interaction with the biopharma sector? Also, are all vaccines free? Do I ever have to pay out of pocket for a dose? If a COVID vaccine is free, are all the other ones free? Does it matter what insurance coverage I have? Questions like this really speak to a changing ecosystem where at the root of this, confidence in those many dimensions are really likely to help guide the debate in the coming years. And finally, the last key theme here is the way the public and private sectors interact on vaccine issues. It is a reality of the past 2 years that we've seen a greater degree and a greater frequency of collaboration between public and private entities. This was just a necessity during the pandemic. It is by and large a positive thing, at least in my view, but it comes with its own complexities. One of which is the nature of the relationship between government and vaccine manufacturers has changed. The government has, for example, always purchased vaccines. We see variations in that country to country, but at least here in the US, the government has always been a purchaser of doses, but never on the scale that we've seen, and certainly not to the degree of investment we've seen in the R&D ecosystem that supports it. And this is something that I think we will see increasing in the coming years as we think about the long-term utility of that mRNA platform that I mentioned earlier. So from here, if we turn from these themes to a couple key topics to run through, and I'll apologize, just given time, I'll move rather quickly, but if we have any questions along the way, let's please come back to those during the Q&A at the end. The first issue, and again, in no particular order, but this is the one that perhaps shows up in the news cycle the most, are vaccine requirements and incentives. So requirements is a policy term for vaccine mandates, quote unquote, and I'll explain the incentives context here in a moment. So we have always had vaccination requirements here in the US, as well as in many other countries. Typically, these requirements are put in place either by a national or local level regulatory or legislative authority. Here in the US, the requirements are by and large a state level enterprise. The federal government, in a few specific ways that we'll get into, plays a role in this space, but primarily this is a state policy issue. We have a fair number of different types of requirements, some of which I'm quite confident you all are familiar with. Perhaps the most obvious are school entry requirements. So having state regulated requirements for routine immunizations, both at the secondary and post-secondary levels. We see some variability state to state in this regard, but generally speaking, there are school entry requirements in some form in place in every jurisdiction here in the US, and as well in certain other countries, although not quite with the same architecture we have here in the US. We also have facility-specific requirements. So this can be something that is driven by a private entity. So a hospital, for example, requiring all of its employees to receive a flu vaccine annually. It could also be something that is state policy or state law driven. So the example I typically like to give to that in many states for long-term care facilities, you actually will have specific vaccination requirements for the patients or the residents at those facilities with a bit of variability on what those requirements look like. We also, of course, have requirements attached to the professions themselves. So obviously the healthcare profession being the obvious example there. And sometimes, as I mentioned, those could be tied to specific facilities. We also increasingly have cross-border related requirements. This is something that has really come to the fore during the pandemic, things that I'm sure you all are familiar with to some degree, like vaccine credentials or vaccine passports. These are, by and large, government-led, government-driven policies. That being said, we do see the private sector involved, at least in the vaccine credential space, in a rather robust way. So, for example, the airline industry playing a role in supporting governments with some of those cross-border issues. And then perhaps most interestingly, we see this expansion of incentives as an option or as an alternative really to requirements. So a couple interesting examples I've seen in my work. We see cities and prefectures in Japan, as an example, offering incentives like coupons, cars, and other goods via raffles for people who have been vaccinated. In Australia, they're even giving away concert tickets in a couple instances as an incentive. And in the UK, several companies like Uber and pizza delivery companies have offered discounts and other incentives to consumers who are vaccinated. So this notion of incentives is something that's fundamentally different from what we've seen with routine immunizations historically, but is an interesting way to consider nudging behavior as we do in other areas of public health versus strictly requiring it, in something I suspect we'll see outside of the COVID-19 context in the years to come. So we've seen a bit on requirements lately from the White House as well. I won't dwell on these too much, but we've seen regulatory activity recently for federal level entities like OSHA, for example, requiring all employers with 100 or more employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19 or undergo weekly testing. We've seen the federal government also put in vaccination requirements for federal workers and some contractors, federal contractors as well. We've seen the federal government recently put out an interim final rule attaching COVID-19 vaccination requirements to conditions of participation for Medicare and Medicaid recipient facilities. So we're seeing more of an emphasis within the federal government's regulatory boundaries, more of an emphasis on requirements as a complement to what we see at the state level. We've also, of course, seen the White House play a strong role recently around booster doses, not only making the regulatory process a little bit quicker than expected in that regard, but also specifically offering free booster doses for COVID-19 vaccines and increasing the access points for individuals to receive those. Federal government has, of course, also emphasized the importance of having school entry requirements, deferring to the states in that regard, but encouraging them to consider those for COVID-19 vaccines specifically. And then, of course, a fair amount of activity on both testing and masking requirements as part of the broader public health countermeasures. So in terms of another topic that we've seen a fair bit on recently, and something that some of you might have some familiarity with, but scope of practice laws really govern the issue, and typically a state level issue, of who's able to prescribe and administer immunizations. And we see a fair amount of variability state to state in this space. And there's been a lot of advocacy activity, in fact, on these issues, including in Texas, over the years, as to which immunizations are included within pharmacist scope of practice laws, which are not, which age groups can be vaccinated in the pharmacy setting versus not, what are the training and credentialing requirements for pharmacists in that regard. And we see fair variability state to state in the types of authority under state law that pharmacists have in this regard. So in some states, as you all might be familiar, state law prescribes a certain level of supervision, typically called a standing order, to be in place in order for pharmacists to administer certain immunizations. In other states, state law allows for a little bit more flexibility in terms of the inherent authority that pharmacists have when it comes to prescribing and administering routinely recommended immunizations. And we've seen this really come to the fore during the pandemic. So the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, or the PrEP Act for short, is used to provide immunity from liability during public health emergencies, though it's not dependent on an emergency declaration. And what we've seen with the PrEP Act is HHS, OGC has interpreted the scope of the PrEP Act to preempt state laws that conflict or limit the ability for pharmacists to administer COVID-19 vaccines. So we're seeing this interesting tension that is an open question after the pandemic between the federal government's view on the one hand on scope of practice and some states' views on the other hand with regard to pharmacists. So moving along, another issue that has been on the global stage particularly noteworthy during the pandemic has been this issue of liability and compensation. So although it's rather rare, individuals can have adverse reactions to an immunization. And so the question then results, if an injury has happened, is there a recourse for that individual to seek liability and compensation as a result of that injury? And particularly given the fact that we had emergency authorizations for several vaccines, obviously in the beginning, it's changed a bit in recent months. This has been a particularly thorny topic. And we've seen really three approaches taken around the world to this issue. And I'll try to take the global perspective here rather than just explaining how the US does things. The first approach is typically just called contractual indemnification. And this has been a real hot button issue. So basically, if you are a country entering into an advanced purchase agreement for COVID-19 vaccines, typically there would be some sort of contractual provision that would indemnify the manufacturer from any liability that might result from injuries happening from individuals receiving doses in that country. These contractual provisions have been a touch point for significant negotiation, in the sense that some vaccine manufacturers, again, this is all public knowledge, have asked and required during the negotiations countries to put up sovereign assets as collateral to the extent that these claims could be significant enough that there is no financial backstop to cover them. You can imagine that being a bit of a thorny issue. The second approach, which is a more preferable approach and what we have tended to see on the whole around the globe, is a combination of contractual indemnification with NFC, or no-fault compensation program. So this is currently the approach put in place by the WHO through COVAX, and it basically allows, in an NFC context, a mechanism to provide compensation to an injured person if certain parameters have been met. So, for example, certain types of injuries would be prescribed as part of the NFC program, and if those injuries can be demonstrated, then in a no-fault way, a payout would happen. Now, there are different ways to fund these programs. We've seen some of them funded, for example, through tax mechanisms, but the idea here is that through a combined approach here, some of the risk is spread differently rather than just falling exclusively on a government's budget. So the third option, one that is in some ways preferable to each of these, is a legislative approach that combines with no-fault compensation. So this has been a tricky issue to put in place. Obviously, spinning up a new piece of legislation and passing it in a country in the middle of a pandemic is a rather tricky thing to do. But the reality is most countries do not have prescribed in their laws no-fault compensation systems in the same way that we do have here in the US. So COVAX on the global level has tried to fill in some of these gaps, but several of the countries are looking at legislative solutions that would apply not just to the COVID-19 context, but to all immunizations in the longer term. In terms of another issue that I think we'll actually see quite a bit in the news in the next couple of weeks has been IP issues. And this is a rather complicated space. I'm going to zero in on just two particular buckets that have been perhaps the most important ones over the past 2 years. First relates to the TRIPS agreement, and the second relates to what's called technology transfer. There's some overlap between these, but we'll distinguish them just for simplicity. So I suspect some of you have some familiarity with the TRIPS agreement. This dates to 1994. It was in effect beginning in 1995, created under the auspices of the WTO. WTO is most of the world, so 164 member states, but not the entire globe. A TRIPS agreement governs the IP minimum standards that national governments or WTO members specifically should set within their own domestic laws. There had been some concern in the early 2000s and in the late 90s, in fact, around higher income countries insisting on an overly narrow reading of those IP protections. And what resulted was called the Doha Declaration in 2001, which is a statement that really clarified the scope and the intent of the TRIPS agreement as not being a way just to safeguard IP interests, but more specifically to permit a reading of the TRIPS agreement that would promote access to medicines around the globe, medicines, of course, intending to include vaccines as well. So the TRIPS agreement has come up in the context of the pandemic in a rather significant way. In October of last year, India and South Africa had proposed a temporary waiver of a variety of different IP requirements within the TRIPS agreement. The intention there being to help allow for local manufacturers to have access to the IP that they need to scale up local manufacturing during a pandemic when we had a real shortage of doses. This has received some support cautiously from the US with regard to COVID-19 vaccines specifically. The European Union has been a little bit more reluctant. Some of the other regions, I'm thinking specifically of APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, has been in support of an IP waiver in this regard. And where this is really coming to a bit of a head is a meeting in a couple of weeks, the WTO ministerial, where the idea is that they would start to hammer out the specific terms of what a waiver could look like. Again, the exact terms and how those terms are negotiated is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of what a temporary waiver could mean in practical terms. And then finally, technology transfer is an issue we've seen in the vaccine space for a long time, but has taken on a new urgency during the pandemic. So technology transfer allows for the voluntary, keyword there, voluntary licensing of technology so that typically local level manufacturers can take up the challenge of manufacturing a biological product, in this case, a vaccine. As you can imagine, industry has generally been very hesitant when it comes to tech transfer. Industry is particularly hesitant in the COVID-19 context because once the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, on the mRNA platform, it starts to look like less of a commercial advantage longer term. So we've seen some middle grounds be pursued out on the regional level recently. So we've seen PAHO in Latin America push for voluntary tech transfer using a couple hubs set up in Brazil and Argentina, at least as an entry point, that would help local manufacturers better work with industry on some of these tech transfer issues to help scale up manufacturing. We're seeing a similar approach taken in Africa as well. So I suspect this is something we'll see more of, but it's an area, again, where a fair amount of negotiation really determines the ultimate practical impact. And then finally, to close on a couple of trade issues that have been particularly meaningful during the pandemic, we have a couple of fundamental truths, if you will, about vaccine production and trade. The first is the simple fact that all countries need vaccines, but not all countries have the ability to produce those vaccines within their own borders. What that leads to is a system, a rather complicated one, of import and export controls, which apply both to the doses themselves as well as all of the ancillary products it takes to make those doses into an actual vaccine and then move those doses around the world. Now, the production of COVID-19 vaccines is rather geographically concentrated. We see a small number of countries have the vaccine manufacturing sites, although this has expanded a bit in the past year, but still a relatively small number, which puts a premium on facilitating the import and export process. The second fundamental truth is the fact that there are strong trade interdependencies, as I alluded to a moment ago, between the dose itself as well as the raw materials it takes to both make and then distribute the dose. And this encompasses everything from active ingredients to vials, needles, syringes, stoppers, cold boxes, freezers, ice boxes, the list goes on and on. It is an incredibly complicated process, and all of those components are generally not produced within the same border, which means that those trade interdependencies have to be sorted out in order for doses to ultimately make it to an individual to have be administered. So we've seen in this regard a couple bottlenecks on the trade front during the pandemic. These are what you see highlighted here on the slide. In terms of tariffs, generally speaking, are relatively low on vaccine products compared to other products. But about 20% of countries still have positive duties on vaccines, and about 8% have duties that exceed 5% of the value of the product, which means that the process of moving doses across borders can be rather cumbersome and rather expensive in the process. We also see tariffs on the supplies themselves. So those actually tend to be a fair bit higher for vaccine-related supplies. I'm not quite sure of the reason for that. It's a bit more of a historical thing. But those tariffs can be as high as about 9.5%, depending on the product. And freezers and dry ice, very critical during the pandemic, over 12%. So these are rather significant barriers that add cost and slow down the movement of doses. We also have non-tariff mechanisms. These are rather complicated, and I'll just hit on them very briefly. These can apply both to vaccines and to ingredients. Typically, NTMs are focused on ensuring that basic safety can be provided in terms of both the dose, the ingredients, and all the other supplies as they move across borders. So you can have NTMs like technical barriers to trade, SPS mechanisms, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. All of these are really geared towards ensuring safety. So they are critically important, but where we've seen problems occur are the simple fact that there are wide differences between jurisdictions when it comes to NTMs. So that further complicates the movement of doses and products around the world during the distribution and manufacturing process. And then finally, with regard to regulatory approvals that I had alluded to earlier, we see very big differences between the regulatory architectures between different jurisdictions. We also see very significant differences in the timelines for regulatory approvals. And those don't just apply to approvals for a COVID-19 vaccine per se. It could be around approvals for the manufacture of a brand new vaccination site in a country where one did not exist before. So all of the regulatory approvals, the good manufacturing practices, all of the important compliance components look very different and are generally not very well harmonized across jurisdictions, which again can slow down the process. And then finally, when it comes to donations, donations obviously have been a huge part of the WHO's efforts in this regard. The US has played a role in this, other countries have as well. While donations have a lot of value, they present their own logistical challenges when it comes to trade. Many of these donations are determined, and the terms for those donations are determined a bit at the last minute, which can present challenges from a regulatory approval standpoint. Very often based on the ultimate destinations for donated doses, those destinations can have their own local requirements that can slow down the distribution process once doses are going through the import and export process. This could be something as simple as different labeling requirements between jurisdictions. And then finally, if there are local level regulatory approval processes that are needed, there is just a simple reality of not a lot of harmonization, as I mentioned before, between jurisdictions in this regard. So if there are different regulatory approvals that need to happen in order for donated doses to find their way to several different countries, those all have to be sorted out in the process as well. So that was a very, very quick tour of a couple key issues with a couple themes that I hope help to illustrate how these things relate together, and then also just, of course, have practical realities for the world that we live in at the moment. So with that, happy to take the balance of time to talk through any questions that you all have. So I will pass it back to Elizabeth and Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that wonderful overview of all the various issues that are so important to this, to the vaccine distribution and to the challenging times that we're living today. So I think we do have a question or two in the chat. I thought maybe I would start with just one question. You know, my area is more in the international trade arena. So of course, you've touched upon a lot of things that I am particularly interested in. But one thing I wanted to ask, as you know, and you mentioned this, the inequities, you know, in getting access to the vaccines and the manufacturing of the vaccines is a global issue, much of which, you know, one of the big trade problems has been at the very beginning, in particular, were the export restrictions, right? Where we saw export restrictions go up, where developed countries in particular were sort of not allowing the export of essential items that were dealing with public health, as well as making it more difficult to sort of get access to these things that needed for manufacturing levels. And so now, you know, some of that is starting to sort of loosen up. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the role of COVAX in all of that, particularly at the beginning stages with allowing for more access to information and financing for developing countries in the area of vaccine development and distribution. And then the other question I had is, there's a lot of similarities in sort of the larger problem of global health and how to manage these things moving forward to the sustainable development arena. And one of the things that I found in the trade and sustainable development conversation that's very challenging is that we don't really have a very good working definition of sustainable development other than the Brundtland report, which was, done many years ago. But we have a hard time sort of identifying what we would consider essential good in environmental good, for example, and so forth. And so that makes it very challenging to create regulatory frameworks that are both global or transnational as well as local in that context. And so it's starting to move forward as people talk more and more about climate change and so forth, but it's still a challenge. And so I'm wondering in the public health arena, in the global public health arena, are there similar challenges in creating a sort of a working definition of what we mean by public health? And is it global or is it local? Are there different definitions locally? And from my perspective, and I'm not a health law expert, it seems that there are even some states within the United States that refuse to sort of think of it as a global health problem or even a public health problem, right? So how does that fit into sort of developing these regulatory structures that you're talking about to sort of allow for more harmonization in the field so that we can, learn from this, but also move forward in addressing not only access to vaccines, distribution of vaccines for COVID, but for other infectious diseases that might arise in the future. So I don't know if you want to answer those first, and then I can sort of gather the questions in the chat, and then I can open it up to others. Does that work?
Sure, that sounds perfect. And those are excellent questions. Thank you for those. On the first question related to COVAX has played a incredibly important role since the very beginning of the pandemic in a couple different ways. The first one you had alluded to, which is really as a financing mechanism for doses, so a pooled procurement mechanism, if you will, to help make doses available for the AMC 92 countries, which are predominantly oriented towards low and middle income countries, of course. Who might not otherwise be in a position to directly contract with manufacturers in that regard. So incredibly important role in that respect. But where I've actually seen COVAX play an arguably more important role is helping to sort out and create global dialogue around multi-stakeholder dialogue, in fact, around all of these other ancillary considerations that some of which I was referencing today. You had alluded to some of the trade issues as well, in creating a forum for people to discuss solutions to those. So that is something that maybe goes to the slightly or fuzzy concept of diplomacy, but at least in a narrow sense, of course, incredibly important role when it comes to pooled purchasing for doses, but also just offering that forum to have conversations between different stakeholder groups about some of these other supporting considerations, which are the things at the end of the day, if we don't have solutions for those, even if we have doses purchased, the entire architecture has to be able to support the movement of those doses to the people that need them in the parts of the world that need it most. And I loved your question on sustainable development. This is something that at least I'm hopeful to see more of a redefinition around coming out of the pandemic. It's certainly something that, as you alluded to, governments are paying more attention to during the pandemic. I think one of the more interesting things I've seen in that regard has been around how governments are thinking about public health purchasing and budget decisions. So this is not just in the vaccine space, but it's something as simple as health ministers and finance ministers having more regular touch points and conversations, and health ministers starting to shape a notion of public health, which is not just as just another part of the government going to the finance minister to ask for budget, but as something that is really a whole of government concern and a whole of population concern. So it's that type of within government coordination that I think has real value as we think about what public health looks like generally after the pandemic, as well as how we think about sustainable development. And a lot of the emphasis I've seen within individual countries has been thinking about this issue of resiliency for different parts of the public health infrastructure. And conversations around resiliency aren't just budget related, it's also looking at delivery mechanisms, for example. It also starts to dovetail with really critical discussions that the WHO has tried to advance for years around health systems capacity building. And so as we start to see some of these things come together, and again, maybe seeing a bit of the silver lining from the current moment, but as some of these things start to come together, I think it creates an opportunity for more meaningful dialogue with corresponding policy solutions being proposed. I think one of the more obvious examples of that, you all have probably seen in the news mention of the pandemic treaty, quote unquote, which is being considered, at least conceptualized, if you will, at the moment. So thinking about some of the vehicles at the global level for making some of these things a reality, I think seems to be at least directionally where we're going.
Thank you. Very interesting. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll start with Matt Brown. His question is, when considering vaccination policy, do you think it's important to distinguish between vaccine hesitancy and vaccine resistance, being firmly against vaccination?
Great question. I think that is a very important distinction. We often see different layers of hesitancy, and I referred to a couple different layers a moment ago, but when it comes to resistance, I've often seen the dialogue on resistance also dovetail with broader concerns about the validity of science, let's say. And that, of course, is something that permeates several different parts of the biopharma sector and has historically. But hesitancy itself, if we think about it in a narrow way, is not just individuals who don't want to receive a vaccine. It's also individuals who maybe just don't have convenient access to the vaccines that they need to. Maybe it's individuals who just have other life barriers in place, like not being able to get time off from work. So I think that distinction between hesitancy and resistance and how this rolls up to broader concerns about science policy generally is definitely the right way to be thinking about some of the policy solutions in this space.
Great. And another question is somewhat related with respect to the politics, right, of all of this. I mean, so I will just expand a little bit on the question. The question talks about the integrity of data and quality of the trials for the COVID-19 vaccine, and that the FDA was alerted but failed to investigate, and this spoon feeds sort of this anti-vax movement and runs contrary to public health efforts to get people on board with the vaccine. And so it's hard to move forward on this needle of trust, and so we need to depoliticize health. And so, in looking at some of the numbers that you mentioned at the very beginning of your talk about what has caused some of the things that you pointed out in your discussion, some of the policy questions and issues sort of has led to these sort of the slowing of vaccination rates. But one of my questions on that, related to Julie's question here or point here, is that isn't it also the politics that has delayed sort of the vaccination rates? And it's not just in the United States, it's in many parts of the world, or maybe it plays out differently in different parts of the world. So I guess maybe just some thoughts or comments on some of the politics. Are you seeing it play out differently in different parts of the world? What can we do to help improve trust on this matter in terms of our faith in the FDA and in government, to sort of to get everyone sort of on board to vaccinate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and these are very tricky questions. I don't know that I can purport to have an example on a broader politics concern like this, but I think important to note the way that consideration rolls up into the entire science policy arena. and certainly spills over into other areas around diplomacy and governance. At least in the vaccine space, what I've seen work really, really well is just having a clear message around the value of vaccination. And so that is a message that both speaks to the individual as something that's important and core to their own personal health, as well as the health of their family members, and is supported by science that is otherwise undisputed and rather robust. And then also speaks to the value, again, to play to the public health importance here of the importance of vaccination to the entire community, both locally, and then you can roll that all the way up to the global level. So I think a really clear message around that, which unfortunately is not always what governments around the world put out, is an important thing as a baseline to have. I think when we get to some of the regulatory issues, I think it's important just to remind folks that agencies like the FDA or the EMA in Europe and in other jurisdictions around the world have tried and true processes to rely on for ensuring that safe and effective products make their way out into the market. And I think the public sometimes, without having full visibility into those processes, tends to doubt first, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously good to ask questions in the process. But what I hope to see coming out of the pandemic is a more broad emphasis on those regulatory agencies really championing their role as part of the public health architecture. And this is something that I know specifically the FDA does within HHS more broadly, but as we think about how some of those regulators interface with the public, helping just to appreciate the processes that are in place, as well as the public health rationale for those processes, can be a really great way to just help build confidence in a system that is otherwise rather complicated, but incredibly important.
Yes, thank you. So we have about 4 minutes, or 4.5 minutes left. I thought maybe Jessica, maybe if you wanted to chime in, or some of the other health law faculty that are here, maybe with some of your some questions or say some final comments.
I mean, I'll jump in. So I had one question that I was hoping to spend a little time exploring. When you were talking about the technology transfers and how it's voluntary, whether a vaccine developer enter into a licensing arrangement with someone that might be able to manufacture this vaccine at a time when we really need to do that and get as much of the world vaccinated as quickly as possible. Has there been any talk at the international level about mandatory licensing, of requiring vaccine developers to enter into these licensing agreements so we can get the vaccine manufactured more quickly?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there has been some discussion of that at the WTO level. But when politics enters into the picture, to go back to the prior question, the notion of involuntary licensing has been really put to the side for the simple fact that it's a rather hard thing, to my understanding, to get done within the existing WTO architecture, but also something that the mechanisms in the negotiations would, in effect, slow things down in a way that in practical terms would not end up with getting the practical realities on the ground where they need to be. So for better or for worse, I think we've been left with the voluntary variety. What I have found encouraging on the voluntary front has been an emphasis not just on the voluntary tech transfer, but also the supporting architecture that a local manufacturer would need. So really shining a light on some of the challenges associated with just standing up manufacturing sites, going through those good manufacturing practices, and making sure that governments are willing to be partners in making those things happen very quickly, so that if there can be agreement on the voluntary tech transfer side, that the facilities locally would be best positioned to act really quickly after that. And unfortunately, many of the manufacturers, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, have been a bit reluctant to enter into those voluntary agreements, but we are at least directionally seeing a situation in which we're getting closer and closer to voluntary tech transfer. I can't quite say when that could happen, but we started from a very firm no to something that's moving in a bit more from public health standpoint, positive direction.
That's good to hear. So there's just a couple minutes left, and I'm going to ask kind of a big question, which is, assuming we at some point get past the COVID pandemic, what's next? I mean, what do you see as the big change that may happen in the global public health space? For me, one or two, since we only have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, of course. Well, I do hope we get past it very, very soon. And I think we all do. I guess the two things that stick out to me, going back to the question posed earlier, I think from you, Elizabeth, about sustainable development. I really hope that coming out of the pandemic, we have a broader and deeper emphasis on public health needs in coordination at the global level in that regard. Obviously, that's something that's very important at the local level, and certainly has been a domestic priority in many countries around the world. But at the global level, we've had a bit of a fragmented system in that regard. So the hope is that as countries individually take more of an emphasis on not just funding for public health, but engaging the public in a meaningful way and having the policy architecture in place to do that, that will roll up to the global level, perhaps with WHO in a leadership role in that regard. And then the other thing that sticks out to me in terms of what's next is simply the ongoing potential that many people see in the vaccine development ecosystem. And this is something that, as I mentioned before, as we've seen innovation expand rather quickly in recent years, we're hopeful to see increased innovation throughout the routine immunization portfolio in the years to come. Now, that doesn't ignore rather the fact that there are significant access barriers that I referenced earlier. And so the idea there, hopefully, is that stakeholders will be more inclined to focus in on addressing those tried and true access barriers that we know to be problematic, not just here in the US, but globally as well, so that as innovation ramps up, access does not stay the same or completely drop off. And some of that really comes down to having strong leadership at the global level to drive some of those conversations. And so I'm encouraged in that sense by what we've seen from the WHO through COVAX over the past 2 years.
So we've hit the 1 o'clock mark. So unfortunately, we do have to end this conversation, but I wanted to thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today. This has been incredibly informative. You raised a lot of interesting issues, probably in some ways as many questions as answers, but we really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us today.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the time. And I had my email address up on the screen before, but always feel free to reach out with questions, and really appreciate the time.
Thank you.